So I want to thank Michael Pisarek for joining us today. He's a six-time Microsoft SharePoint MVP. He's also, and more importantly, the CEO of Orchestra Software. And he's going to share with us today about governance and pragmatic governance specifically for Microsoft Teams. And governance is still a hot topic. And so I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Once governance is not a one and done kind of thing, and it does impact your adoption for Microsoft Teams. So Michael, I'm really looking forward to what you have to share today.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Jeremy. Welcome, everybody. Bright and early on a Monday morning. So this is great. Well, not so early for you folks over on the East Coast, a little bit early here. So so this session is entitled Pragmatic Governance for Microsoft Teams. It really is meant to give you some ideas and a bit of a roadmap in terms of implementing governance for teams within your organization. We'll get into what we're trying to talk about and where, but I think one of the biggest challenges that we've found, and I'm sure it's fairly familiar to everyone on this call and listening, is Microsoft Teams governance is one of the really hot topics, particularly what we've seen with our customer base, whether they're commercial or government clients. When customers moved and had to go to remote work scenarios over a weekend, typically governance wasn't really at the kind of forefront of planning, so there's some issues there. The other thing that we're also seeing, which is a bit more interesting, is now customers are moving away from Skype and into Teams. And once again, we want to make sure there's a little bit of governance planning around that. So we'll talk about all of the steps and all of the stages that you can go through. So a bit about myself. So my name's Michael Pisarek, 6 times Microsoft SharePoint MVP. I'm currently the CEO of Orchestra. Previously to this, I had another company called Bonsai Intranet. So we were one of the largest intranet in a box vendors. We got acquired in 2018 and had a bit of a break and had a baby and got a dog, all of that sort of stuff. And then recently, about a year ago, we launched Orchestra. So Orchestra is a new platform. We call it a governance and adoption and a lifecycle management platform for Microsoft 365. Really, the idea with Orchestra is to fill in a lot of the gaps that Microsoft either doesn't provide from a governance and a change management and a lifecycle perspective, or build upon some of those capabilities that maybe Microsoft has, but maybe they're part of additional licensing, which you don't want to purchase also. So I'll see if we can get to a quick sneak peek of Orchestra, but if you are interested, let me know. We can arrange a demo. So for an agenda today, we'll talk about some session goals so we can level set so everyone knows what we're going to talk about. So if you're expecting this to be an advanced PowerShell governance session on the Power Platform, you might be a bit disappointed. Then we'll talk about, firstly, we'll take it from the high level. So we'll talk about some strategic objectives and how it plays a role in governance. Frequently when we speak to customers, I think the problem with governance especially is it's a kind of term that means a little bit of a different thing to different people within an organization. It means different things to IT people, different things to end users, but also different things for executives also. The best place where we think to start is really looking at it from a strategic and an organizational lens. So we'll talk about that. Then we'll talk about some of the actual implementation of actually implementing governance in Microsoft 365 and Microsoft Teams. There's a lot of knobs, there's a lot of options, there's a lot of things you can do out of the box, whether it's through the Teams Admin Center or through Azure AD or through SharePoint. Some might say there's almost too many options, but there's so many capabilities that you can implement out of the box to implement some of these governance policies. So we'll talk about all of those at a broad level, what can they be applied to and how they can be applied. And then the last thing that we'll do is we'll go through what we call some pragmatic governance examples. So the way that we're going to do that is we're going to pretend we're 3 different organizations, one organization which is very open, one which is somewhere in the middle, and one which is very closed and very locked down. And we'll talk about how we can implement those options for those 3 different types of organizations. And hopefully it'll give you a good understanding of what you can do, how you can do it, and like I said, give you the ability to actually take this back to your organization or to your department or whatever it is, and start having some conversations, maybe even implementing some of these pieces. The reason that we do that is I think there's a lot of kind of governance presentations around. I think a lot of them are very high level. What I want to make sure is at the end of this session, you actually have some tangible things that you can go back and start to talk about and start to try as well. So in terms of some session goals. So first we'll talk about what governance is and what it entails. Like I said, I think one of the main challenges with governance is that it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and these conversations can get really, really bogged down when we and really, really stalled with organizations where really they should be doing a governance implementation, but they spend the majority of the time just trying to work out what the scope of a governance engagement is and trying to define the word governance, which doesn't make any sense. Next, we'll talk about some of the out-of-the-box examples Microsoft 365 provides. And from a governance perspective, there is a ton out there. There's so many options. There's so many things that you can do out of the box without using things like PowerShell. And the nice thing is as well, you can also enable these options very, very quickly and very, very easily. And a lot of these options also have tenant-wide defaults, as well as policies that can be applied to individual users or groups of users as well. So we'll talk about all of those. We'll talk about some scenarios, like I said before, in terms of how you might think about implementing some of these governance policies. And of course, the main goal of this session is to provide you with some tangible examples that you can take back to your organization and start to implement. So, all right, so let's start talking a little bit about governance and strategy in Teams and Microsoft 365. And we try to start here. The reason that we do that, like I said originally, is governance needs to have a starting point. And really the starting point should be some of the policies that you have within your organization. Now with government, we find it's a little bit easier than we're working with commercial clients, because from a governance perspective, a lot of the things that drive governance is really around the policies, the laws, the jurisdiction, whatever that is. So interestingly enough, for government clients, we find it's actually much easier to do a governance engagement because you actually have some tangible policies, rules that you're actually trying to follow. For commercial clients, it can be a little bit more difficult as things are a little bit more nebulous there. So we find, like I said, from a strategic perspective, really what we're trying to do with governance is to drive adoption. I don't believe that locking everything down is definitely the way to go. I think a lot of organizations, particularly in government, go down that route. I think there's a bit of balance that needs to be applied. But once again, the goal should be, a dynamic and frictionless kind of self-service environment for your users and some robust management. And being really honest, like I said, there are gaps within Microsoft from that frictionless self-service aspect. That's why solutions like Orchestra exist. That's why you find a lot of organizations are leveraging something like the Power Platform or code to make these pieces available. But like I said, there is that capability there. So from a strategic perspective, really governance is that process, right, of defining the people, the policies, the rules, and the structure within Teams and Microsoft 365. From a typical governance plan, the types of things that you're probably looking at, making sure you have roles defined, so different roles and different use cases and responsibilities. Those roles could be things like IT and end users and Azure AD admins and team owners and team members. Defining for each role what those responsibilities are and what those roles can actually do. Defining some processors around those pieces also. Making sure you understand access and ownership, and also things like policies. So going down for a little bit more of a sub-level, understand policies for things like managing content and other attributes for teams in particular. And what can governance help you achieve? So once again, why go through this process? So particularly for government clients, ensuring that you're compliant is a really big deal. So making sure that you're compliant with the rules within your organization. They could be legal, they could be social, they could be cultural rules, they could be things like SOX also. The other thing that I would also recommend to customers and to everyone on this call is to think how you can leverage governance from an adoption perspective, right? One of the things, or one of the challenges that we see with Teams, there's just so much out there within the platform. There's so many capabilities. I know in the government cloud's a little bit less than in the commercial cloud, but even still, there's so much to the Teams platform. There's so many capabilities there that one of the ways that you can use some of these governance policies is to almost control the rollout of features. And I'll show you how you can do that as well. Probably the biggest two things that we find, though, is around managing sprawl. So one of the main challenge, I think, with self-service from a Microsoft Teams perspective in particular, is that sprawl of content that happens when people have self-service available. And I'll show you some stats from one of our latest customers which I think might be fairly common. If self-service is enabled, for instance, without any real governance in place, people are creating teams, there could be information leaks and everything else through there also. Now, where you fit from a governance perspective is going to really differ on your organization. And I think, once again, this is where people really get confused. There's no real right answer from a governance perspective in terms of how much control, how many policies you want to apply. So there's no right answer for every organization, but there's going to be a right answer for your organization. So whether you're very limited in terms of, kind of no governance control in place, that can work really well, particularly if you want to have some, really fast sort of collaboration happen. The other thing you can also do is go down a very tightly controlled mechanism. This is much more common with our government clients than it is with our commercial clients, for instance. It is a good approach. You do have more control, but once again, you're reducing that dynamic nature of being able to create teams, collaborating teams, and do things. And that onus goes back on IT, especially if you have something like a process that you have to go through around going through requesting teams, for instance. So what typically happens when you don't do this? Well, you get stories like this. Now, I don't know if this resonates to anyone on the call, or if you're in this kind of position, but this is an example of a current client that we are working with. So a large US-based multinational, about 12,000 users. They're using Teams for over a year, but there was never really any launch. People just started using it. But this is really common. I'm not sure what you've seen in your organizations. We see this a lot. Teams is just like, well, it's a tool, we're just going to roll it out. It's happened particularly over COVID. We're also finding this really happening in terms of people moving from Skype as well, where they think that Skype to Teams transition is the one-to-one, but they don't understand the very different tools. But in this organization, they didn't really roll out Teams. It just kind of appeared. They didn't put any governance in place. It was just kind of there, so anyone could create teams. So in January, they had about 2,000 teams. In April, they had about 3,000. They were growing 40% in 2.5 months, which is not great. And some really typical stats here. So out of those 3,000 teams, 2,300 of them only have the general channel. This is really, really common. So people really aren't using Teams. They're not adding additional channels. They're not adding additional tabs. We see a lot of organizations have a bunch of teams that have test in the name, whether it's test, testing, TST. Basically, once again, these is kind of, teams which are allowed to be created. People go in. Someone like me goes in and thinks, oh, this is interesting. I'm going to create a team called test. I use it for 5 minutes and then I never kind of use it again. 719 teams have 1 member, so that's probably not a good thing. If teams have 1 member, you're not really collaborating. That's like an individual team. Around 50 of those teams have 0 owners, 0 members. 78 teams have 0 owners, so that's great, and that's a really common thing. This concept of what we call ownerless teams or orphan teams, huge challenge. Orphan teams in particular, not just from a technical perspective, because then your members have to go back to IT to ask questions, but also the bigger challenges from that content ownership perspective as well. This organization does allow private channels also. They had about 620 private channels contained across 78 teams. So you can see the teams that were using private channels were using them a lot. And once again, that could be a challenge. And of course, one team had 156 channels, which isn't kind of great. But once again, we find that can be really, really common, especially for organizations that don't have any governance and don't have any kind of training in place also. So these types of stats aren't too dissimilar for the types of clients that we see. And we've got, some really good stories. We've also got some horror stories as well from other customers where, out of 3,000 teams, they may be using 50 of them, right? The other, 2,900 of them is just people creating stuff because they don't know what it is. Probably the best story that we heard was we saw in one organization, there was a person that would create a team for every single meeting that they had, and they had multiple meetings per day because they weren't trained, there was no governance in place, and they read somewhere that that's how you were supposed to do things. So every time there was a meeting, like a research meeting. They would create an entire new team for that. They would add all of these people. It was insane. But once again, no governance, no training, and these are the types of situations you might get into. Now, not all is lost though, because in Microsoft, they actually have a bunch of really good content around governance for teams in particular. If you go to the Microsoft Research Adoption Hub, if you actually go here, step 2, in terms of the governance Quickstart, this is a really, really good resource. Of course, you can consult with partners and everything else, but this is actually really, really good. There's some really good starting points. And what Microsoft does is, instead of trying to cover everything, they really start to break this down. And this governance Quickstart has like the 5 main things you need to think about governance. And the first one actually is around that provisioning creation process, and we'll talk about in that in just a moment also. So what happens then? So let's say we do have some policies, we have some laws. We need to make sure that whatever we do in Microsoft Teams are aligned to those pieces. How are these pieces actually implemented in Microsoft 365? Like, what are some of those technical underpinnings? What can you do? It turns out there is a lot. So there's a ton of governance capabilities for Microsoft Teams as well as Microsoft 365 within the platform, which you as an admin can go in and you can change and you can tweak very quickly and very, very easily. Now, the first thing really you need to understand is, in order to govern Teams, you need to govern Office 365 or Microsoft 365 groups. Now, for the more technical people on the call, I'm sure that you understand this. For the less technical people on the call, every time that you create a Microsoft team, there's a whole bunch of other stuff that gets created with it. You get a SharePoint site, you get an Outlook mailbox, for example. Sometimes you get a planner plan. Sometimes, depending on if you're using Yammer, you might also get a Yammer group associated with that also. The problem with that is that Teams and this groups concept is intertwined together. And there's a lot of governance settings on the team side, but there's also a governance setting on the Microsoft Group side as well. So even though there's a Teams admin center, there's no real Teams governance admin center, if that makes sense. You have to go to multiple different pieces in order to kind of weave all of this together. Now, groups are fantastic, particularly from an end user perspective, but they do cause some challenges, particularly from an IT management and a sprawl perspective. So if you are looking at governance from this technical perspective, first thing that I would recommend is to really understand that Microsoft 365 groups model, and then you can start to bring in some of those learnings, and you can see what you can apply at the team level, as well as the Microsoft 365 group level also. In terms of where governance is applied, like I said, there's really 3 different areas. Now, 3 different main areas, just so you know, there's a lot more. So either these settings are applied at the team level itself, or it's applied at the group level, or it's applied through the Security and Compliance Center, which can apply either to the team or the group, or really applies to the content mostly stored within that Microsoft team. So there's 3 different kind of places there that you have to look at. So Teams is typically things like permissions and so forth. Groups is at a little bit of a higher level. So you might be looking at membership. You might be looking at something like Teams lifecycle. Also, whereas security compliance, you're looking at things like data loss prevention, retention policies, and all of those other things that are available within that center. In terms of how this actually gets applied, if you look at the setting, there's also 2 main types of settings that you can apply. There's what's called a global setting, which essentially applies as a default to everyone that uses the platform within your organization. And then there's actually policies, and these policies are the pieces that can be assigned to individual users or groups of users also. So you have, like I said, a whole range of flexibility there, where you can have, let's say, your blanket setting that's applied to everyone, and then you can also have a policy that's going to be applied to individual users or individual groups of users. So lots of flexibility there. One of the challenges you might experience, which we commonly do, is applying a setting which is global tends to take effect really, really quickly. Assigning a policy which is assigned to users or groups of users, creating that policy within the Teams admin center and then applying that application of that policy to individual users or groups can take a little bit of time. So just be wary of that. Sometimes it takes up to 24 hours for those policies to apply. I don't think there's any official SLA from Microsoft's side, but just so you know, you apply a policy and nothing happens, you might just have to wait. Now, typically they're pretty good in terms of once they get applied, they do work, but just so you know, there's a little bit of a lag that you might find there. So what can you do? What are some of these governance controls within Teams? Turns out there is a ton that's available just in the Teams admin center, and also if we start adding in some of the groups pieces as well. But this definitely shocks me in terms of how many options there are, and also in a lot of cases, how many organizations don't know that these options exist. So there's a lot there. Around applications, for instance, things like application permission policies and application setup policies. So being able to control both third-party and internal Teams apps within your organization. You can control what's available there. You can also automatically pin apps to users' Teams based on, once again, particular rules and policies that you have there also. There's a lot of governance controls, particularly for meetings, both for meeting settings and meeting policies. So in meetings, not only can you control who can create meetings, who can start meetings, you can even do things like control what people can share, for instance, during meetings. Maybe you don't want people to be able to share, let's say, their entire desktop, because one of the really frequent forms of data loss is, you're in a meeting and you see someone that's sharing their desktop and they're moving between programs, and for a split second their email comes up. Right, that's a really common thing that happens. I'm shocked that doesn't get talked more about from a data loss prevention. So maybe you don't want to allow people to share their entire desktop during meetings. Maybe you just want them allowed to share an individual program. For instance, you can do that as well. A lot of more team-specific things. So team settings, what people can do with Teams, what people can do in channels. Also, we'll talk about all of these. And then, of course, things like guest access and external access. Lots of capabilities around controlling guests or external users within your organization. Messaging policies for individual messages. There's a lot there, basically. That's where I would like to kind of, hopefully this comes across, and we'll show you some of these. So where do you get started, right? What are those things that you might want to look at? So hopefully this slide can help. So the first thing that we see with organizations undergoing some governance planning around Teams is probably the first step is understanding and defining who can create Teams, SharePoint sites, OneDrives, and groups. That's probably the most obvious starting point that a lot of organizations take on. So this question of, are we going to enable self-service for our users? So our users can go and just go into Teams, create a team, put in a name, maybe choose a template, put in a description, although no one ever puts in a team description there, and then away they go. Or do we want to lock that down for everyone? Or do we want to have a bit of a middle approach there, where we're going to allow some users to create teams and other users not to? So there's a whole range of options around there, above and beyond, of course, using third-party tools or Power Apps or just a manual process. The next thing, which is really common that we work with organizations around, is around naming conventions. So as you know, people don't name things very well. And if you think that they're going to name teams correctly, I encourage you to go to maybe your local file shares and see how people name folders and files, because it doesn't make sense to anyone apart from the person who created those initial things. And really, from a naming perspective, that typically happens with teams also. If there's no naming conventions applied, people tend to create things in ways they think they should be named. One of the issues with that is, of course, people don't understand the purpose of that team. But the other big issue is, I don't know if you've ever tried to search for a team through Microsoft Teams. That team search experience is awful. Like, it's awful. I don't know how the search is implemented, but from what I can understand, if you've got a term in the middle of a team name, it doesn't pick that up. It has to be like an exact match. It's just not very good. So once again, there's some governance options around that. So out of the box, Microsoft 365 has the ability to do some group naming with prefixes and suffixes. You can put in static strings. You can also use user attributes. You can also put in a list of blocked words. So if you don't want people to use particular words, let's say, during your team's name, that's something that's really common. I'll give you some examples of these, but common block words could be, people don't want to use things like privacy. Acronyms can be really problematic, although I know everyone in the government loves a good 3-letter acronym. That's maybe something you don't want people to use in Teams. And you certainly don't want people to use things in Teams which correspond to maybe a sensitivity or how, let's say, valuable that information is. So, people using things like the word official within Teams or approved within team names cannot work very well. So you might want to control them. Next thing that we tend to talk about is around guest access. So once again, bringing guests into your M365 environment, some questions around this, who can add guests, whether you want to allow guests or not, and what that process is for guests also, not only at the team level, but also at the SharePoint site level. And they're quite different, unfortunately. The controlling of guests at the team at the group level versus the SharePoint site level can be really, really different. But once again, if you are allowing guests within your organization, so guests are people external from your organizations coming in and collaborating, you want to have some governance around that. The next thing is around expiry. So once again, I think a challenge that organizations will start to face, maybe not now, but I think in the next year or two, is, well, what are we going to do with these hundreds of teams that we're creating a year? Because a lot of those teams are going to be transactional in nature, where they're going to be spun up for a short period of time and they're going to be wound down. So what we're finding with our customers is that, maybe they're a couple of years into Teams, particularly because of COVID. They might have, 1,000, 10,000 teams, but the ones which are actively used is maybe 20% at any one time. So what's going to be that strategy to kind of, archive these teams? Now, Teams has an archive team capability. It doesn't really do much, just makes the SharePoint site read-only, for instance, and it removes it from the Teams UI. But once again, Microsoft 365 does have some capabilities around that in terms of setting expiration durations. So the ability to set it up in such a way that, let's say, for instance, you provide a team to a user. If that team doesn't get used for 30 days, Microsoft 365 will actually ping that person and ask them, hey, are you using it or not? And if not, it can go through an archive process. Next thing is around policies. So once again, a really common thing to get started with. Now, this is a whole another world of, I guess, hurt for some people, but it's a whole nother world that you can look at. So things like retention, e-discovery, DLP, all of those pieces, once again, can be applied from that governance perspective. I know in the government, for our government clients, things like retention and data loss prevention is really, really important. So this kind of gets moved up this list of priorities also. But once again, it's a good place to start, particularly if this is being driven from that strategic perspective by some of the laws and the laws and policies that you have to follow. Next thing that we typically do as well is talk about templates. So once again, if you're not aware, Teams templates give you the ability to, instead of your users requesting blank teams, they can actually request a team that's based on a template, and you can have some pre-configured apps there. You can have some pre-configured channels. We think this is a great way to drive adoption and provide standardization within your organization. It can be incredibly useful. And then finally, monitoring. So what you want to do from a governance perspective as you start is really understand what's going on. Now, unfortunately, my personal take on the reporting capabilities of Microsoft 365 in general is there's a lot of reports. They're all in different places, and some of them are useful, some of them are not that useful, but there's no real one kind of view of what you want to see. Now, that is what it is. I think it's just because Microsoft 365 is so huge. And you've got, so many different types of users and different types of admins that you might need to have different types of reporting. But it can be a little bit difficult to understand exactly what's going on within your team's environment, maybe from a content management perspective. But there is a lot there. You just have to jump between these kind of different areas. So from a monitoring perspective, looking at the Teams Admin Center, the SharePoint Admin Center, the M365 Admin Center. From an adoption perspective, the Office 365 adoption content pack is really, really useful. But once again, if you're going to be monitoring this stuff, unfortunately, you're going to have to fly across, all of these admin centers through here as well. All right, I'm going to grab a quick drink. Before we jump into some scenarios, any questions, thoughts, feedback from anyone on the call so far?
Hey, this is Patrick. It's great information. I just wanted to say I'm not an admin in my tenant, so getting this perspective is really helpful, and I appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks, Patrick. Yeah, if you're not an admin, and once again, with M365, there's like 27 billion different types of admins also, so that's the other thing. But there is a lot there. So, a lot of the times we hear that some IT organizations are saying, well, we don't know where this information is, or we can't get it. It's definitely there. It's just that there's just so much in M365, it can be a little bit difficult to get, but you've got some options there. All right, so let's talk about some kind of pragmatic governance scenarios. So we got all this information, we've got our strategic stuff, we know how can we actually, what options are available, how do we go through the process of tweaking these knobs, like what can we do? So let's talk about how we can actually make this happen. So the way we're going to do this is we are going to pretend we have 3 different types of organizations. So the first one is called Lockdown Corp. Now, maybe for this presentation, it should be called Government Corp, but hey, let's call it Lockdown Corp. So Lockdown Corp, their strategic governance kind of policies and initiatives, they're very highly regulated, right? They want to lean to very kind of restrictive settings through all of these scenarios that we have. So that makes sense. All the way on the other side, though, we have Startup Inc. So Startup Inc. is one of these, rapidly growing startups. They've got like $100 trillion in funding, beanbags. You go into the office, there's like a barista. He's one of these hipster barista people, who really loves coffee. So they're making coffees. But essentially what they're doing is they're growing like crazy. And they want to use Teams to drive growth and collaboration as fast as possible. So for any of these scenarios, they want to empower their users. They're going to lean to the out-of-the-box settings as much as possible. And then we have balanced industries. So balanced industries is right in the middle. And what they want to do is strike a balance between IT control and end user adoption. So they're going to consider both sides. Now, I wish more organizations were like balanced industries. Unfortunately, they're not. Most organizations we find are like Startup Inc., but they don't think they are. And this is something that's really, really important and to kind of shock people when I say this. If you deploy Teams and you don't change any of the out-of-the-box options, you might be Lockdown Corp, but your Teams environment or your Microsoft 365 environment is going to be functioning like Startup Inc. because by default, the vast majority of the settings in Microsoft 365 are very, very open. And it almost shocks me when we go to customers and they say, we have everything locked down and, we know we do. And then we go into their Teams environment. People can create anything. The default link option is share with anyone. And they're like, well, how could this happen? Surely, this is more locked down. It's not. It's very, very open. So like I said, you might be Lockdown Corp from a governance policies perspective, but you might be functioning like Startup Inc., particularly if you haven't gone through this process of tweaking some of these knobs, for instance. So hopefully that'll give you an example. So let's go through some of these scenarios. First one, like we talked about, is around Teams creation, right? So this is probably the first step that people make around any sort of governance implementation. They typically make it really early on, either because they've had SharePoint before and they remember the old days of self-service site collections within SharePoint and some of the craziness that resulted in that. Or alternatively, what we're finding is people who rolled out Teams a year ago and they're in the same situation as you saw previously, where they've got 20% growth of Teams month on month, 3,000 teams. Most of them are being used. A bunch of teams will test in the name and so forth. So the first thing around this kind of Teams creation is really who will be able to create groups and teams within your organization. Now that's really the question that you have. From an implementation perspective, this is fairly simple. Now to turn off group creation, I think Microsoft tries to make it as difficult as possible for you. There's a whole bunch of different places you have to do, but there's lots of documentation out there. What you want to consider is, like I said, limiting who can create teams in particular can certainly aid in controlling sprawl and enforcing some structure, but it also comes at the cost of self-service and additional load. And typically that additional load has to come on IT, because if you're going to go through the process of someone creating a form and filling out a form, typically, unless they're using something like the Power Platform, for instance, that process gets done manually. So you've got a bit of balance there. Once again, if anyone can create teams and groups, you need to at least educate your people or give them some sort of governance policies or some sort of guidelines through that. If it is locked down, so you don't want to use the out-of-the-box Teams or the out-of-the-box M365 interface, you need to create a process to enable this. So whether it's Flow, Power Apps, custom code, a tool like ours, whether it's through a completely different system, we see a lot with a lot of our customers that they want that kind of request process for a team to go through something like ServiceNow, because that's where people are doing everything anyway, for instance. But you need to have, like I said, some sort of process there. Now, how would this be applied to our 3 different companies, this kind of teams creation scenario? So Lockdown Corp obviously is going to disable everything, right? So they're going to lock down the creation of teams through the native UI, and they're going to use a tool, let's say it's a Power App or maybe a form, to control the request and the approval of teams. So once again, pretty standard thing. All you would basically do is remove the ability for anyone to go and create groups. Now remember, because groups and teams are so intertwined, I think a lot of people get confused and they say, well, we want to allow users to create teams, but, oh, sorry, we don't want to allow users to create teams, but we do want to allow them to create SharePoint sites, right? You can't actually do that, right? SharePoint team sites. You can't do that because these things are both group based. So in this case, if you're not allowing people to create teams, ergo, you're not allowing people to create Microsoft groups, ergo, they also cannot create team sites also. So it's something important to consider there. So Lockdown Corp is going to disable everything, and everything's going to go through some sort of other process. Balanced Industries is a little bit more balanced, remember? So they have an interesting approach, and this approach I like, and I wish more organizations did this. So Balanced Industries is going to allow some people to create teams. But what they're going to do is, before you can go and actually create a team, maybe you have to go through a quick 15-minute training process, right? Which tells you about the types of teams that are available, maybe some of the naming conventions that you can use, and also your responsibilities as an owner when you're creating that team. So what they've set up is, they've set up in such a way that by default, no one can create groups or teams unless you're in this very specific Active Directory group, and you can be added to there as a user or as an admin after you've gone through training. So once again, you've got a bit of a balanced approach right there. And of course, Startup Inc. is all good. They want people to create as many teams and groups, whatever keeps them growing available. So once again, Startup Inc. is just going to use the default options. Remember, by default, if you don't change anything in Microsoft 365, you're going to be Startup Inc. And Startup Inc. in this case is going to, or you're going to be allowed to create whatever you like. Next thing that we can do is talk about default and available apps. This is another one which I don't think a lot of organizations know, and this is a really good example of using some of these policies both from a governance perspective, but also from an adoption perspective. So your decision point here is, which apps do we want to give our users access to? And also, which apps do we want to default for our users? You can actually do both. So if you're not familiar with Teams, you can go into Teams, you can click on Add an App, and depending on how you have this set up, either users can go and add from any third-party app that's in Microsoft Teams at the moment, of which at the moment I think there's more than 1,000 third-party apps that users can add. You can control the list of those things, but you can also control and by default pin apps to people's Teams rail on the left-hand side. And not only pin the same app to everyone, you can pin different apps for different groups of users, which can be really, really powerful. So some considerations here, once again, your organization wants to control or promote applications that users are using within Teams. Really the decision point around from what's available is, what apps do you want to make available both from the Teams App Store, as well as any internally developed apps. These are called custom apps within the context of Teams. So custom apps are essentially apps that you've maybe created within your organization and you want to make them available to the rest of the organization also. One of the things you can't do, though, you can't use these policies to remove the default apps that come with Teams, right? You can make them more difficult to find by removing them, but they appear within those dots so people can get access to it anyway. Now, once again, the implementation of this is a little bit difficult because there's actually 3 things you need to configure here. So application setup policies, application permission policies, and what we call org-wide settings as well. All right, so how do we implement this? So let's talk about Lockdown Corp. So Lockdown Corp, they want to remove access to any third-party apps. They don't want to allow users to add any personal apps, and they don't want to allow users even to pin apps that they are using. So basically what Lockdown Corp wants to do is they want to completely control that app experience for users within Teams. So users can't add any additional apps, they can't pin any personal apps, and they can't really customize any apps either. So the way that Lockdown Corp would do this is for the org-wide setting, let me get the old laser pointer out here. For the org-wide setting, they're going to disable third-party apps. So essentially, when they click on add apps, there's not going to be any apps visible from the App Store there. They're not going to allow any new third-party apps to be published. This is a really interesting option. This is really subtle, but I think it's kind of neat. The idea with this is when this policy takes effect, right? Of course, Microsoft is going to be releasing new and new apps constantly through that. So you can set this org-wide setting that you can say, no matter whether the app is that third-party app is published now or in the future, we're not going to allow them. Or you can say, well, we're not going to allow any of the apps as of this moment in time, but any new ones we're going to make available also. And the other thing as well from the org-wide settings is we're not going to allow people to use any custom apps. Now, if you can see by my drawing here, I'm obviously using a mouse. I don't have a touchscreen, so I apologize for that. So custom apps are essentially any apps that have been developed internally. This setting for custom apps, just so you know, this typically we found in a lot of organizations was turned to off. It's starting to be turned to on. The reason for that is the way that Microsoft Viva is deployed is actually through a Teams custom app. So if you have this as disabled as an org-wide setting, you're not going to be able to deploy Microsoft Viva to your organization. That's something to consider. Now, from Lockdown Corp, from the application permission policy, now you can apply these rules to Microsoft apps. So Lockdown Corp's going to block all of them. They're going to block all third-party apps, and they're going to block all custom apps also. And then from an application setup policy, they're not going to allow users to upload custom apps. They're not going to allow user pinning. And basically, on this left-hand side, this is what they get. So you do have this option within Teams. So if you're Lockdown Corp, we're going to lock everything down. People can't really do anything. Away they go. Balanced industries is a little bit more balanced. So what they're going to do, they are going to allow some custom apps, right? They're not going to allow all of them. And they're also going to allow users to pin apps that they basically use. But they're also going to pin a third-party app. It could be Microsoft Viva, it could be Orchestra, whatever that is. They're going to pin that app by default to certain groups of users. So in this case, for their application permission policy, they are allowing Microsoft apps. So they're going to allow people to use some of those Microsoft apps that come with Teams. They are going to allow some third-party apps. There's a really good option here where you can allow specific apps and block all others. So essentially, they're blocking every app, but they're allowing the Adobe Creative Cloud, the Jira Cloud, and Stack Overflow for Teams. And they've got a custom app. It could be Orchestra, it could be Viva, but the idea is, once again, they're going to allow a custom app that people can either add that app themselves, or what they've also done is they've allowed people to pin this app, or they're pinning this app by default. And this pinned app thing, this has become really popular now, because this is the way that if you're rolling out Microsoft Viva within your organization, Viva is a custom app based in Teams. This is the way that you probably want to roll it out, right? So you want to give people the ability to go for that Viva app just to appear one day when they log in Teams. This is how you would set that up. So a little bit of a balanced approach here, right? They're not going to allow any third-party app. They're going to limit the third-party apps that are available there. And they're also going to give users the ability to add custom apps as well. And then finally, Startup Inc. Just uses the default settings. So once again, by default, you can add any app, or any third-party app, whether it's available now or in the future. Users allow custom apps. Users can pin. They can change things around. Lots and lots of flexibility here as well. So once again, if you haven't made any of these changes, by default, you're going to be running as Startup Inc. here. So this is the really, really common thing. Now, what we're finding with our customers in the government space, typically they're much more balanced, or even Lockdown Corp, particularly around third-party applications. But you've got a lot of flexibility here. The way that this is implemented within Microsoft Teams, I think, is probably one of the better things that Microsoft has done. Particularly this button here. This allows any new third-party apps to be published to the store by default. If you're limiting apps now, you probably want to control that in a little bit more of a fashion. So that gives you the ability to do that. All right. Next thing we're going to talk about. Teams naming policies. This is a huge deal. So really the governance decisions around this is you want to enforce conventions on how teams and groups are named. The reason for that is huge effect on findability, right? Well, teams and groups also. The other thing is, like I said, you want to make sure that those team names are representative of what's actually within that team, and you want to have some common naming policies and naming conventions, right? So not one person comes in and creates a team called Project Space Alpha, another one is Project Dash Alpha, and another one is Alpha Dash Project, right? This is really common that we find. So let's say we're all working on a project together. I go and create a team called Project Alpha and make it private. Jeremy creates a team called Project Dash Alpha, right? As far as Teams is concerned, these are two separate things. Me and Jeremy spend 2 or 3 days configuring, adding documents, and we start adding the same groups of users until we realize, shoot, we've created 2 teams which are conceptually the same. And then you say, well, that's okay, let's just merge these things together. It's not that easy, right? Merging these teams together isn't going to be easy. Also, of course, my team is going to win and not Jeremy's team, because my team's probably configured better than his. But the problem is, like I said, everyone creates everything privately. People spin up these 2 things. They don't invite anyone in there. And then you've got these 2 kind of teams that exist together, which, like I said, 2 different teams. They're conceptually the same thing. Merging these things together can be really difficult. Documents are easy. Conversations, though, if we've started to have conversations with these individual teams, can be really, really problematic, if not impossible. You have to look at a third-party tool for that. So having good naming conventions would work, because if I tried to create a project team called Project Alpha, and then Jeremy went in and used that same thing, unfortunately, out of the box, it's not going to stop it, which kind of sucks. But at least if he searched for it, or maybe we have a list of teams somewhere, it would help him, find that particular team. So once again, there's some naming policy out-of-the-box capabilities that Microsoft 365 provides. I'm a huge fan of naming policies. I think it's super, super useful in terms of that. So we'll give you some examples of common naming policies that we see. So for project teams or sites, even having a prefix of PRJ or PROJ, dash the project ID and the descriptive name can be really, really useful. For department teams and sites, the EPT, the classification and department name. We see a lot of organizations as well, because guest access can be such a huge, huge deal. Prefixing the name of the team with something like EXT for external users, or guest access, so people actually know when they look at a team and it has EXT or guest in it, that there's guests within there. If it's a multinational example, that ability to have things like the geography or business unit. And then the Harvard naming convention is probably one of the better examples. And this is within Harvard. They put the organization and the school name prefix, dash the department name, and dash the actual descriptive name of those teams. So they do a pretty good job. But but from a governance perspective and an end user perspective, it's just nice. If I'm an end user, these teams are actually pretty well kind of labeled and called anyway. So this is not too bad here. But just adding a prefix, I'll know instantly what's a department, what's a project. Whether there's external users through here, right? Whether this Contoso team, the department that it belongs to, as well as the geography. So this is just really, really simple things. The other thing you might want to apply this to as well, which we're finding is more prevalent, is channel naming conventions. Also, making sure you've got channel naming. Now, within M365, there is, like I said, some naming policies. They're done at the group level. They're not very good, to be honest with you, because it's done at the group level. You don't really get much granularity in terms of the different templates, but there is some out-of-the-box capabilities there. You can also build it yourself. You can do it manually also if you need to as well. All right, next one we're going to talk about. Teams owner and member settings. So lots of decision points around here. Basically, the owner settings, if someone's an owner, they really do have a lot of capabilities. Really, the main thing that we find working with or organizations looking at is exactly what team members can do. So the decision point around this, what are members of teams allowed to do? Now, in some organizations, you want your members, or you want these teams to be locked down as possible, where essentially the owner acts as a steward of that team, and all the members can do is basically just go in and add content and have conversations. Whereas you might want to go down the other approach, where members can essentially almost do as much as what owners can do. They can create channels and create private channels, they can add apps, they can add all sorts of things also. But the nice thing is you can control this on a team by team basis in terms of the permissions. So let's talk a little bit around how this could work. So Lockdown Corp, strangely enough, Lockdown Corp really wants to control what members want to do in teams. So they're going to pretty much disable everything for teams permissions. The other thing is, because Lockdown Corp is super highly regulated, they also don't even want to give their members the permissions to delete or edit any messages they have, since everything is regarded as an official record. We have seen this in purpose. So you can actually set this up in such a way that as a member, you can't create channels, you can't update channels, you can't do anything with apps, you can't do anything with tabs, you can't do anything with connectors. And also, if I go in and I start a conversation within a team, a post, as a member, if I make a mistake, I can't edit or I can't delete this also. So this is possible. It can get highly annoying for users, but you do have the ability to do that. Balanced Industries wants to go down a bit more of a balanced approach, and I quite like this approach. So in this case, what you're basically saying is your members are going to be able to post things in teams, they're going to be able to edit their message, they're going to be able to add tabs, but they can't go and add applications, and they can't go and add channels. Essentially what you're saying is the team owner is going to be responsible almost for the structure of that team in terms of the channels and how it's essentially set up, whereas the members are going to be responsible for content and maybe adding tabs within those existing channels. So this is, once again, really easy to set up. In terms of the permissions, once again, you would kind of remove a lot of the permissions in terms of creating and updating channels through here and apps, and you're going to allow your members to add tabs and connectors. So almost your members, they've kind of got a little bit more that they can do than with Lockdown Corp. Not only can they go and post and edit documents, all of that sort of stuff, but the other thing they can also do is add tabs in those existing channels that exist. So it's quite a nice balanced approach. Essentially, the owners kind of like the stewards and making sure they control the structure of that team, and your members can do everything else. And they have a little bit of flexibility, adding some configuration to some of the additional content that they have within that team. And finally is Startup Inc. So Startup Inc., like I said, is going to use the out-of-the-box settings. So once again, this is what happens out of the box within Microsoft 365. Members do have a lot of permissions, right? They can go and add channels, apps. They can also delete channels and restore them. The deleting of the channel can be really, really problematic if a member does it. The other thing that can be really problematic is if you use the out-of-the-box wiki capability within Microsoft Teams. If someone goes in and deletes that wiki app, for some reason that wiki content just vanishes, never to return. So that's another common thing. It's also a reason that we see a lot of organizations using something like OneNote as opposed to wiki. But once again, like I said, if you haven't made any of these governance changes, you're functioning like Startup Inc. And Startup Inc. by default, a lot of things members can do a lot of things here. All right, let's go through the final one here. And let's talk about meeting settings. So there's a bunch of other settings. We've talked about teams, we've talked about naming, we've talked about creation. There's also a lot of settings from a governance perspective in terms of Teams meetings as well. There's a ton of them. There's actually so much that we're only going to cover content sharing and guests. There's a ton of Teams meeting related settings within Microsoft 365 that you can have a look at. But we're going to talk about two in particular. We're going to talk about content sharing and guests. Now, there's two decision points you basically want to have around this. Decision points will be how a user is going to be able to share content during a Teams meeting, because you can actually control this, and what should guests be allowed to do during a Teams meeting. Now, the reason that I bring these up is, like I said, I think anecdotally, from we've heard from our customers, a lot of the kind of data loss mechanisms or data loss that happens frequently happens during meetings, where, like I said, during a meeting, someone's sharing their screen. When it's really awkward when you're sharing your screen and someone types you a message, and that message is from someone else who's in the same meeting, and they may be saying something about someone within that meeting. Or, like I said, you're switching between slides, or you're switching to try to find what you want, and maybe for a brief second, the salary spreadsheet is open, or maybe even your email is open as well. So once again, it's a frequent loss of content. The other thing is, what should guests be able to do? So if you're a guest to a meeting, should you be able to take control of the screen, for instance, right? Should you be able to share content? Should you be able to start a meeting? There's a ton of policies and settings that you can apply for Teams meetings. So let's talk about a couple of them before we wrap up here. So Lockdown Corp. So Lockdown Corp has issues in the past with data leaks during meetings. So they're a little bit hesitant. So what Lockdown Corp's going to do is they're not going to allow anonymous users to join meetings. And what they're also going to do is any meeting that started, they're only going to allow people to share a PowerPoint presentation, right? Now, I know in practice, probably this doesn't happen. Lockdown Corp is an extreme organization after all, but it does give you the abilities of some of the flexibility that the Microsoft capabilities provide. So in this case, Lockdown Corp's not going to allow anonymous users to join a meeting. From a content sharing perspective, this screen sharing mode you can see, this is actually disabled. So users, when you click on share, users in that meeting are not going to get the option to share their screen. It just doesn't appear there. They're not going to allow a participant to give or request control. So in this case, I can't take over someone's screen, whether I'm from within the organization or a guest. They are going to allow PowerPoint sharing. They're not going to allow the whiteboard feature. They're not going to allow shared notes either. And from a guest perspective, they're not going to allow anonymous people. They're only going to admit people from your organizations. They're not going to allow people to bypass the lobbies. Not going to allow live captions or even chat in meetings. They're going to turn all of that stuff off. You can see you can control a lot of these things. Now, this is one of many options that are available within the Teams meeting settings, but there's a lot of flexibility there. So in this case, Lockdown Corp, the only thing you can basically do is you jump on, you see a PowerPoint presentation, you can talk, and that's pretty much it. Bit of an extreme example, but hopefully it gives you the ability to show you just how much flexibility you have. Balanced Industries is going to allow sharing, but they're going to do something smart. They're actually only going to allow sharing for a single application. So, for someone to share their Outlook, unfortunately, they would actually have to go through a couple of different steps. So I quite like this option. I think it's pretty decent. They're going to allow guests to bypass, or they're going to allow dial-in guests into meetings. They're not going to allow them to start meetings or to bypass the lobby through here. So once again, in this case, they're going to change this default mode to a single application. They're not going to allow external guests to give or request control. I think this is a really interesting one also. So this ability that you can actually control if guests can request control of someone's screen. There could be use cases for that. Someone's logged in, I don't know, to a server, for instance. They want to get control of that, but you can control that as well. They're going to allow PowerPoint sharing. Well, whiteboard, they're also going to allow shared notes also. And from a participant's perspective, or from a participants and guest perspective, they're still not going to allow external people. They're going to allow Meet Now in private meetings. They're going to allow some private captions, but users can override. Once again, a bit more of a balanced approach here. And then finally, we have startup industry. So Startup Inc., they're good. They're just going to allow anyone to do anything. Now, once again, this is going to be the default approach that people can see, right? So if you haven't gone and basically done anything in terms of or changed any of these options, this is what you're going to be running at. So by default, a lot of, the anonymous people, even guests, have got a lot of power. People can share whatever they want. They can share their screens. People can request access. People can request control. Guests can request control as well. Once again, there's a lot of things which are fairly open. You might want to look at those particular pieces. All right. So just to wrap up here, some key takeaway and conclusions. So hopefully, the first thing is think about using governance both to control and empower your people. I really like the idea of using some of these governance policies to almost remove some of the technical complexity with Teams. Put it this way, let's say the whiteboard feature is something that you're interested in as an organization, but you don't want to roll it out first without any training. You can use a governance policy to remove that whiteboard feature, maybe have some change management, some communication, and then re-enable that through one of these governance policies. So it's a good example of thinking about it from a control perspective, but also thinking about it from the end user perspective as well. Hopefully, I've shown you that there's a ton of governance options all out of the box. Like there's an incredible amount of things that you can tweak. We've probably gone through 1,000th of the settings there. But there is a lot that you can do from that control perspective also. Like I said, make sure you think about from a user experience perspective what you're trying to do. Don't just lock everything down. Try to be more like Balanced Industries than Lockdown Corp, or maybe Startup Inc. I think try to be a little bit more balanced. Think about ways and ingenious approaches that you can provide, so you can provide that self-service experience to your users, but also have all of those governance policies in place. And like I said to a lot of companies, if you haven't done any of this governance planning and you haven't actually changed anything, your organization might be Lockdown Corp, but your teams in your M365 environment might be functioning like Startup Inc. Now, in government, that's much less prevalent because I think there's much more of an emphasis on things like security and data loss. But I can tell you in a lot of our commercial customers, people roll out teams, they expect that all of this stuff is going to be, locked down. It's not by default. So like I said, maybe talk to your IT folks or try to understand exactly where people are, and make sure that the policies that you've implemented within teams aligns to that strategic direction of your organization. Right. Before I hand it back over to Jeremy, any questions from anyone on the line here?
I don't have a question. I just have I'm scared. I'm gonna have to go check my settings. Even though I'm in government, I don't know how well we thought out that spectrum. So it'll be interesting to go back and review those.
Yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot there. I mean, there's an incredible amount of things that you can do. I know when I started looking at it, it was kind of like a rabbit hole. It was like, oh man, there's just so many things that you can tweak with these policies and with these settings. But we found the same thing. There's a lot of occasions we find that, like I said, customers think they're Lockdown Corp, but they've just rolled out teams and they're Startup Inc. And we show them, right? Oh yeah, man, I can do this. Yeah, I can add this. Oh yeah, I can share this document with anyone. I was like, well, isn't there an approval process for sharing with anyone? No, I can do that as well. So there's definitely some things you want to look at and consider.
Well, and of course, as Microsoft adds new features, it defaults to Startup Inc.
Exactly, and that's probably the issue and what annoys people the most. Microsoft, runs as Startup Inc. for Teams, and in a very kind of pessimistic sort of way. It makes sense of that, right? I mean, Microsoft's business is to get your content into their cloud as fast as possible, right? So why would they lock things down? It's kind of counterintuitive, but I think you need to make sure that you understand that as an organization and some of the ramifications that could cause.
Well, Michael, thank you for coming to us today. This has been fantastic. I'm scared, and I guess I should be. That's kind of the lesson learned to ensure our governance is up to date. And we look forward to, I see the webinars you have here. Look forward to taking advantage of some of those.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, just let us know. If you have any questions as well, just feel free to reach out to me.